Everybody, welcome back to class. This is going to be another one of my bonus lectures. So not required viewing, but I hope a lot of you do view it and take something away from it and really enjoy it. Now, unlike a lot of my past lectures that have focused on big historical figures or, something that looking at big picture history stuff, this one is going to be much more personal and near and dear to my heart as I'm looking at both of my grandpa's stories and experiences from that World War II era. Let me say, I'm a blessed person, and I have a ton of gratitude for just basically the family that I was born into. I had wonderful parents. I had an awesome brother, all kinds of cool aunts and uncles. And the icing on the cake was I had four amazing grandparents that all would have fallen into the greatest generation, which every generation, if you're not aware of it, kind of gets a different title or name. Now, that's pretty big billing for us to call any one generation the greatest generation of all time. And definitely it's a subjective thing that's opinion based. But in my opinion, I think this group of people does live up to that billing. I mean, you think about it, when they were born kind of in the 1920s, and then their formative years are through the 1930s, the worst economic downturn in American history. Unemployment's through the roof. People are poor. It's one of the only times in American history where there really wasn't even enough food to go around, and people are literally dying of malnutrition. That definitely impacted all of my grandparents, just growing up and having their formative years being in that really depressed time. And then by the time they're kind of, young adult age, that's when the Pearl Harbor attack and World War II breaks out, and America is going to be thrust into this massive conflict. And millions of young men, American young men, are going to be sent overseas to make the world safe for democracy. So no, maybe I'm a little bit biased in this, but I definitely do think, and I look at it as personal examples. I look at my four grandparents, and specifically my two grandpas, and think, yeah, that does make sense to me that we call this group of individuals, or this generation, the greatest generation, because man, they sacrificed so much. They went through such extreme hardships, and they came out the other end and really kind of developed and helped build and contribute to what modern America is. All right, so enough of my intro. Let's get going with the presentation. All right, here we are with Grandpa Stan, or Stanley Taluki, who would be my dad's dad. Now, he was born and raised in Jackson County, right here on like the family property. Actually, his parents, his dad was named Walenti, and his mom and dad were born in Poland, but migrated over here in the early 1900s. So think back to like when like Teddy Roosevelt was president, and the lectures I did on him. That was roughly when my family, the Taluki family, left Poland, came in through Ellis Island in New York, where like the Statue of Liberty is. Apparently, our last name used to have like a ski, or was a little bit longer, but as was pretty common in this time period, the name got chopped up and kind of Americanized and came out as Taluki. And then they made their way on through to Jackson, Michigan, which I guess, from what I gather of it, sounded like there was a lot of people that were from their area of Poland that had migrated and set up kind of a community here in Jackson, Michigan, which was a big Polish neighborhood kind of in the southeast side of the city of Jackson. Now, they didn't move right into town. They actually bought some land, and it's still in the family today. And my grandpa was actually born in the old farmhouse that still stands over there where the Taluki farm market was. Now, his experience as a child, think about it, he's born into the roaring 20s, but for a lot of Americans, especially if you were a little kid at the time, your experience in the roaring 20s wasn't going to jazz clubs and speakeasies and bootlegging, hooch or booze with Al Capone or something like that. They were little kids, and honestly, from their perspective, I don't think that they saw a big transition from the Roaring '20s to the Great Depression, because he was a poor farm kid. Had a big family, big Polish Catholic family. I think it was 9 brothers and sisters, so a lot of mouths to feed. And I think his experience as a child was the stories he told me They were very materially poor. They didn't have much stuff. Even by if you were to compare it to today's standards, I think even the poorest people among us, the poorest, that might live below the poverty line and really struggle to make ends meet, still have far more material wealth than what your average person would have had back in the 1920s or 30s, kind of in the situation that my family was in. A story that's always kind of stuck with me was, how kids look forward to Christmas. Well, obviously, Christmas has been a big holiday for many, many generations. It's part of Western culture, a big Catholic holiday too. And today, we think of Christmas coming and you're all pumped up as a kid to get like little gadgets and gizmos and action figures or maybe some electronic device. Well, that stuff primarily didn't really exist back at that time. There weren't plastic action figures and definitely not electronics. Uh, but even like where rich kids could afford toys, like, you know what I mean, manufactured toys, my family, the Toluki side of the family, was definitely not wealthy enough to purchase that for the kids. And my grandpa said that he would always get excited for getting fruit, stuff that he wouldn't normally get to eat. And it wasn't even like candy canes or cake or Christmas cookies or things that we would think of today. He would actually get really pumped up to have some oranges and bananas in his stocking. So think of that. If you ever don't get what you want for Christmas, could be a lot. It could be worse. If you had been born a few generations ago, you probably wouldn't be expecting any toys or gadgets or gizmos. You might be just pumped up to get a tasty little orange in your stocking. Anyway, I always thought that kind of boggled my mind as a kid, thinking of how different times were. Anyway, my grandpa gets about a elementary education where that was pretty common in the era where you'd go to school. Now, some kids it was starting to become normal to go through to high school. My grandpa did not because he was a boy in a small kind of poor farm family. So I think he went to school to a one-room schoolhouse until he was in about sixth grade or so, learning reading, writing, arithmetic, a lot of the basics. And then he was off to help support the family and work on the family farm. So again, not a terrible situation. It wasn't like he was a kid that was getting stuck down in a coal mine or anything like that. But at a pretty young age, he is kind of out of schooling and helping make ends meet for the family and doing work to support the family farm. As he grew up, he eventually was starting to look for a factory job. He ended up meeting my grandma Helen, who you can't see it perfectly in these photos. They're a little bit blurry, but man, Grandma Helen, she was a looker just like Grandpa Stan was. And they ended up finding each other, getting married, and having a daughter before World War II breaks out. Okay. So the daughter right there in the photo is my Aunt Mary, who love, and she's always been near and dear to my heart too. One of my favorite aunts, and got all kinds of great stories and experiences with her too. Anyway, as he's starting out the family, he's getting ready to build a house on the family property. Okay, so he has the basement dug out and back for somebody at his social standing at the time and but his means, he's going to do most of the building and construction of the house himself, and he's building on the family property, which meant that he was out there like digging a basement with a shovel and a wheelbarrow. He had the family mule, I think, helping pull scoops out. His brothers were helping him with it, but they were doing this all themselves, building him a house for his family. And he was out there, I guess, mixing, concrete and stuff to pour the basement foundations. They had basically the ground level laid on it, and that was when the Pearl Harbor attack happened, and that changes everything. I've talked occasionally about those like moments in history where everybody pauses and like you remember what you were doing when you heard of it. The 9/11 attacks were kind of like that in my lifetime. Well, I would imagine Pearl Harbor was like that for my grandparents' generation, where when they heard about that attack, you knew America was getting involved in this conflict that had been going on for a few years, but that this is going to change everything. And of course it did. So the house is kind of halfway constructed, just basically the foundations and base level. And then Grandpa gets drafted into the military, and he's going to be shipped off to boot camp in Texas, where he's going to go through all the training and learn how to go over and fight the Nazis in Europe. My grandma actually was able to make a few, I think one trip down to Texas, and then he was able to come back home before he got deployed. And they both, I remember him making comments that, man, Grandpa lost a lot of weight, and he was looking really lean after boot camp. And that was one part because of all the hard work he was doing in boot camp, and part two, I guess the Army food, not all that great. I remember remember a story that when my grandma went down to Texas and saw him, he was able to get leave from boot camp for a minute, or maybe this was right as boot camp was finishing up. They went out to a little diner, and he was kind of embarrassed by it, but he actually ordered two dinners because he was so hungry and kind of starved for some delicious food. So anyway, he goes through, makes it through boot camp and everything, and think of how, man, this would be a really trying experience. You're going into combat. You're going to go fight this, experienced veteran Nazi army, and you're leaving your young bride, your wife at home, and your little daughter. And on top of that, you're leaving them in a half finished house. So I guess the story goes, once we get into the war, everything starts to get rationed. Fuel, anything that would be made out of metal. We stop making washing machines and cars, and now all our factories are getting retooled to make weapons of war, and just everything is rationed. It really changed people's lives here on the home front because you couldn't go buy nails at the hardware store anymore. All that metal's being used to make bullets and tanks and planes. So my grandma and Aunt Mary actually had to live in the basement of this house throughout the whole time, basically the rest of the war, while Grandpa's going to be overseas. And they actually had other family members that were willing to come and do work and help build the house. The problem was they couldn't get the materials they needed because everything was rationed. So Grandma and Aunt Mary, they live in the basement of what will be my grandparents' house for the remainder of the war. Now moving on with Grandpa's story a little bit. So gets his training in boot camp in Texas, and then he is getting shipped off and stationed in southern England, and he's going to be over there for a little while until the D-Day attack happens, which we had covered pretty extensively in class. Now, Grandpa Stan was not involved in the actual storming of the beaches. He wasn't at Utah Beach or Omaha Beach, but he did go in, and if you remember, I kind of talked about how General Patton, old blood and guts, he was kind of a controversial figure. The Germans regarded him as our best general. He was very aggressive. My grandpa always said, because he's going to be stationed or be in General Patton's division, and he talked about how all the soldiers called him old blood and guts. And the joke was that because he was so aggressive, his units often had higher casualty rates. So it was like the soldiers, it was our blood, but his guts. And you know what I mean? That was kind of where that nickname comes from. But I know Grandpa also very much, and it sounded like most of the men he served with really, even though they didn't know General Patton personally, they respected him and thought he was a good commander. Well, Patton had gotten himself into some trouble and was actually not part of the D-Day invasion, which really, really bugged him. But shortly after the D-Day invasion, he is given a command back. He's in charge of the 3rd Army Group, which is what my grandpa, that's the division or the Army group that he's going to serve in. So he gets deployed a few weeks after the D-Day invasion, once we kind of have a foothold into the beaches of Normandy, and he's basically going to fight with Patton's army from there on through to the end of the war. Now, early on, the opening months, it's going to be really heavy, intense fighting. The Germans are pushing back. They're trying to squash that invasion. So I guess Grandpa saw quite a bit of heavy combat. Now, a lot of veterans don't want to talk about their stories after they come back home from the war. That was not the case with my Grandpa Stan. He didn't talk about him a ton. I don't think he was hung up on him, and it wasn't like every time you sat down with him, he was telling you a war story. Nothing like that. But I was a kid that was really interested in history from a pretty young age, and I knew he was a veteran, so I would often ask him questions about it. And what was really cool for me as a kid, he was open about it, and he would talk to me. Now, I think he omitted a lot of details and left some stuff out, because sometimes he'd get going on a story, and then Grandma Helen would be sitting there listening. And you got to remember, I was maybe 10, 12, 14 years old at the time these conversations were happening, and Grandma Helen would be kind of like and knock it off, and would nip certain stories in the bud. But he was pretty open and honest with me, and would tell me a lot of stories and share a lot of his experiences from the war. So I asked him, like, an initial question from a young kid would be, Grandpa, did you ever kill any Germans? Did you shoot any of them? Have any close encounters like that? And he said, it was really hard to tell. He was actually a machine gunner running a 30 cal machine gun, and he would have had a 1911 or a 45 caliber pistol on his side. It's not the pistol you're seeing right here. I'll explain that in just a second. But he had that was what he was assigned to do. He was a machine gunner. And he said that, often he would be in combat experiences, but like the Germans were across the field, and he'd see some Germans running or moving around, and he'd let some bullets fly, and he never could really tell a lot of the time if he actually hit them or not, because of course when you start hearing enemy machine gun fire, no matter which side you're on, you're going to drop. You hit the deck, you know what I mean? You get down low. So a lot of times he couldn't tell if he actually hit them or if it was just that they were taking cover. But I guess a lot of the fighting was like that. Another combat story. Now, maybe he had other experiences where he for sure did it, but that was something he didn't want to tell me as a young kid at the time. Who knows on that? Anyway, some other close calls my grandpa had. One time he was in a foxhole and he could see Germans kind of across the field, and we were squared off. I'm not sure exactly what part of France they were fighting in at the time, but the Germans across the field actually had a mortar. We talked about those back in World War I, but they're used again, of course, in World War II. Those are kind of like short range artillery where it'll fire a round up out of a tube, boom, and it'll lob a shell over it with a high explosive on it, kind of almost like a grenade. And you're trying to lob shells in and take out some enemy position. Well, he saw a German mortar kind of fixing in on him, and boom, there was a big explosion, maybe 50 yards off. And then the next one, they retool it and they readjust, and they could still see him there with his machine gun occasionally firing off rounds. And the next one got maybe 20, 30 feet closer, and then another 20, 30 feet closer. And he realized, oh crap, there is a German mortar over there trying to zero in on me and get me. So he made up his mind. Each shell was getting closer and closer. And he finally decided, man, after the next shell, I'm going to pull my machine gun down and just hide in my foxhole. And then hopefully they'll think they got me and they'll leave me alone, which I guess that was the case. That time, because there's not much fighting back again if you're a machine gunner against a mortar that you can't even really see where the shells are coming from. So after that next shell drop, he pulled everything into the foxhole and just laid low for a few minutes, and they stopped firing at him because hopefully they assumed that they got him, but kind of a close call there. Now, I guess Grandpa Stan was around high explosives a lot. One thing that I always knew just from the time I knew him, of course, on, that he was hard of hearing. A lot of times you'd be sitting there talking with him on the couch or in the living room, and you'd say something to him, and you'd get a, huh? What was that? And come again? And I think it was actually his left ear, if I remember right, that he was really, really hard of hearing in. And he had told me that was because a few times he had a grenade go off or a mortar really close next to him, and it damaged his hearing. Now, on top of that, I'm somebody that shoots guns quite a bit. That's one of my big hobbies. Anytime I go out, I typically always wear ear protection, because the couple times I have gone out shooting, especially bigger guns or higher caliber guns like Grandpa's 45, his pistol. I have a similar model pistol myself, and I shot it one time without earmuffs, and my ears were ringing for hours. Now think about it. All of these guys, they didn't wear ear protection out in combat, and they're firing high-powered rifles, high-powered machine guns. Their pistols are 45 caliber, which is a pretty big, beefy round, and you have mortars and grenades and artillery going off all over. It's a wonder any of these guys could hear after the war, because if you've never been around explosions like that, gunfire that loud, it's shockingly loud. So their ears must have been ringing all the time, and they're exposed to this often day after day, week after week, month after month, this really loud stuff. So definitely hearing loss was something a lot of these veterans took with them for the rest of the war. Another good story for you. So they would cycle these machine gunners out in shifts. You obviously can't leave your guys out 24/7 because people have to sleep and eat and kind of recharge their batteries. Well, there apparently was 4 machine gunners at this one post one time, and they had group 1, 2, 3, and 4, and these crews of like generally 2 guys that would go out at their position, and they're going to man that foxhole or that part of the line and keep an eye on the enemy. Well, there was, I guess, a Latino guy. I never got his name, and I don't think my grandpa recalled it, but it was another Latino guy that was in his unit who wanted to be number 1 group, wanted to be the first ones to cycle out. And my grandpa said it honestly didn't matter to him that much where he was at. Either way, you were serving the same amount of time out there and going to be out on the front lines. before they'd cycle you out and give you a break. Well, I guess that Latino guy, my grandpa said, that's fine, go ahead and take first group. And when my grandpa went out there, because he was the number two guy that would come out afterwards to relieve him, when he got to that post, that guy was laying there dead, had been shot. So the Germans had gotten him. And that was one of the stories that my grandpa would get a little bit choked up on because, man, that's a close call. Think if he had just been that first guy out there, chances are he would have been the one that would have got shot and killed in that circumstance. So a lot of soldiers, whether they survive or didn't survive, a lot of it does come down to random chance and luck. If you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, things could definitely go bad for you. Uh, Next story for you. Another one that my grandpa. This is the other story that he would often get choked up about. Now, when you get towards the end of the war, where the German army is surrendering and Nazi Germany is collapsing. I'm talking in the closing, probably about 3 to 6 months of the war. Hitler gives the order that all German soldiers are to fight to the death. But unlike the Japanese, most of the German soldiers have a mindset more like us, or this Western mindset where it's like they don't have the honor culture that the Japanese had, where they would do bonsai charges and in kamikaze, suicide missions. Typically, your average German soldier, once they get into a hopeless situation, they're going to surrender. They'll do their duty, but then they're gonna surrender when they have no chance of victory. And my grandpa said in the closing months, he accepted the surrender. His unit accepted the surrender of tons and tons of German Wehrmacht, or the regular German infantry. And he said that, it was standard procedure. You'd always take things off of the Germans, anything of value, money, obviously weapons, pistols, rifles, anything like that, or daggers or knives that they might have. But they would also take off things like watches and rings, anything that's like metal. And he said one regular German soldier one time, he was going and they were taking everything off of this group of guys that had just surrendered. My grandpa pointed at his watch, and the guy, I guess, got really choked up and started, kind of crying and begging with them. And there was the language barrier because my grandpa spoke English and the German guy spoke German, but he kept saying, no, nein, mein Frau, which my grandpa knew enough German to know that he was trying to say that no, his wife or his girlfriend had given that to him. And my grandpa said, that was the policy, that you had to take that stuff off him. So he said, nope, give it to me. And he took it from him. But my grandpa, I think years later, he always kind of reflected on that and remembered it and thought, man, that guy was probably just not a hardened Nazi. He was just some average German soldier that got caught up into this fighting. And he always felt bad about taking that from him, that personal, personal item. And anyways, he always felt kind of bad about that. Now, another kind of perk, I guess, to being a Allied soldier at that point in the war was when you did take stuff off of these German troops that were surrendering, you basically, their stuff was kind of up for grabs because we're not going to give them all this Nazi stuff or their guns back to them. So I think it was every Allied soldier could have up to like one German pistol that they were allowed to take, but you could take all of the Nazi armbands or German money or anything like that you wanted. So my grandpa actually had a pretty good collection of some different war memorabilia or little souvenirs from Nazi Germany. This was an officer pistol he took that is still in the family today. And I actually, he took this off. It would not be what a normal German soldier or like an infantry soldier would have. It's a smaller officer pistol. So he took it off somebody with a little bit of rank to him. And it's a 25 caliber Mauser pistol. And I did take it into a gun shop one time and I fired it once to make sure it actually worked. Which it did. And they told me that this one is in phenomenally good shape and you get quite a bit of money for it. But of course, nobody in the family ever plans on selling that one, as it is definitely a family heirloom that we're going to keep, safe and secure in the family safe for future generations to enjoy too, as it's something that, is a piece of history and specifically our grandpa's experience in World War II. Now, another thing, when he would be taking the surrender of these German soldiers that were surrendering. Remember, Hitler did give the order that you guys are going to fight to the end, fight to the last man. Your average German soldier wasn't too interested in doing that, but there were the SS units, the black shirts, the guys that had like the skull and crossbones and the two little lightning bolts. We talked about them a little bit. Those are the guys that are like running the concentration camps and in the Einsatzgruppen. They're the most die-hard Nazis that are loyal Hitler supporters. Those guys, a lot of them did fight to the death, and they would kind of disperse them and put one or two SS guys in regular army units to try to coerce those average German soldiers into being loyal and fighting to the death. Well, apparently, when these guys would surrender, even a lot of the regular German soldiers didn't like the guys in the SS. So the vast majority of German POWs were just sent to the back, and they were going to be, kept in prison camps. And honestly, I've read stories from those guys. A lot of them said that once they were taken as American POWs, they actually ate better and were treated better than they were in the German army in those closing months of the war. But a lot of the regular German guys, they didn't like those guys that were the hardened SS Nazis either, and they would often point them out and say SS, SS, and like point that out to the American and British soldiers. Now, this wasn't official army policy, but there was kind of an attitude that those guys, those really hardcore Nazis, they could not be rehabilitated. That they are what they are. And I guess my grandpa, according to him, he never did this. And if you knew Grandpa Stan, I think I find this believable because he never struck me as a mean-spirited guy or somebody who was bloodthirsty or anything like that. He was a very, very sweet, soft-hearted man. Anyway, his commanding officer would say something essentially like, all right, who wants to volunteer to take out the trash? And that was code slang for we've got a couple of these SS guys and we're going to take them out back and just shoot them. Now, you wouldn't make official reports on that because that was not official policy, but I think that it's important to like talk about realism when we're covering history too. And it sounded like my grandpa said he never volunteered to do that, but he said there was never any shortage of guys that were willing to do it. So one of those kind of darker sides of war. Anyway, then final story for you for Grandpa Stan's experience. He was over there through to the basically the end of the war. He was stationed down in southern Germany when the official surrender happens and the war is over. And you survived. You made it. That was he said, a really good, refreshing feeling. He had made tons of while over there. It seemed like when I looked through his photo album, man, he had all kinds of other guys that probably their stories are pretty darn similar to my grandpa's, but lots of friend and like buddy pics where, you hear, and I wouldn't know this personally because I've never been in the military and definitely haven't been in combat. And you guys haven't either, but it's really common for guys that serve together in combat situations. Often on the battlefield, you're not out there thinking like, man, I'm making the world safe for democracy, or you're not justifying your experience with these lofty, ideological goals. Usually those guys, they're out there fighting for the guy next to them, for their family back home, and for their brothers in arms, their comrades out there on the battlefield. And it seemed like my grandpa was really close to a lot of the guys in his unit. Here's just one picture out of dozens and dozens that I have where they were out kind of clowning around. And this was right at the end of the war once they had made it through it. And they're kind of celebrating and getting ready to come back home. This is my grandpa Stan right here, that good looking dude. So you know where I get my looks from, right? Okay, so the war is kind of wrapped up. I guess my grandpa was super eager to get back home and see his wife, his daughter, his family, and to return on to normal life. Pretty understandable. I think I would have been too. Well, they're loading everybody up onto the boats, I guess. You're going to make that long voyage back across the Atlantic. They got to keep their uniforms and, the souvenirs they had taken off the Germans, but you had to give your guns and your equipment back. You were supposed to check those in, which he definitely did for like his machine gun. But the pistol that he had carried for the whole war, this 1911 pistol, which is just like a 45 caliber pistol. Most of you, whether you realize it or not, have probably seen those. It's a very iconic American firearm. It was the standard U.S. military firearm from World War I through to the Vietnam War. All right. So anyway, that was what my grandpa carried as a sidearm because he was a machine gunner. They had been told to turn those in, but he still had it on him, was carrying it on his hip. He had got on the boat and he was kind of planning on, man, I don't think Uncle Sam would miss just one pistol. It was pretty near and dear to him. So he was going to try to just kind of sneak that out and take that as a souvenir back to civilian life with him. Well, apparently when he was getting off the boats in New York, his sergeant came on and talked to all the guys there, and everybody's excited to get off and go see their families. And he said, "You guys better not have anything on you that you shouldn't, and we're going to strip search y'all as you're getting off the boat." And that kind of freaked my grandpa out because, of course, the last thing he wants to get home to his family. He certainly doesn't want to get detained by the military or court-martialed or anything like that for trying to sneak some pistol out of there. So I guess he just went and dumped it kind of in the latrines, and that was the end of that pistol. And then he said once was going out and through all the check lines and everything, they never ever searched him. He could have just walked right out with it, and they would have never known. So maybe Grandpa should have been more upfront and honest and turned that in right away. But as a kid, and I still think to this day, I'm always like, Grandpa, I wish you would have just kind of stuck that in the back of your belt and kept it, because not that it's a gun that we would be shooting or using a lot, but man, it's a cool piece of history. And boy, I would have liked to have had my grandpa's pistol from World War II and been able to keep that in the family. Now, one of the best parts about my grandpa's whole story is, too, what I'll leave you with. He had these experiences in the war, and so many soldiers that experienced the combat that he had experienced and seen buddies die and everything. A lot of guys, it changes them, and they don't want to talk about it, or they shut down and they get severe PTSD. That's super unfortunate, and it wasn't very well understood back then. But I think one of the most remarkable things about both of my grandpa's experiences and millions of other guys from this generation was not not even necessarily the fighting they did in the war, but that once they got through all that, they were able to adjust back to regular life and be good people, upstanding members of the community, be there for their families, and go on and have great lives. That's definitely the case for Grandpa Stan. Once he got out, I would have never guessed him to be, or thought of him as, some veteran that had been horribly scarred by his experiences in the war. He always just seemed like a really happy, jovial, fun guy to be around, and he impacted my life in a really positive way. So hopefully you've enjoyed his experiences, and let me tell you, he's no longer with us, but he went on to live a great life, lived to 89 years old. What an awesome guy, and he's always been very near and dear to my heart. Okay, now it's time for Papa Houston's story. Check out that dashing young airman there. That was a photo of my Papa right before he deployed and went overseas, after he was finishing up with all his training and boot camp and gunnery school and that kind of stuff. I'm often asked, like, Taluki, where did you get your striking good looks from? Well, there you go, some photographic evidence. Kidding around. Actually, I don't think I'm probably even close to as good looking as Papa Houston was back in the day. Well, at least I'm far better looking than my Uncles Craig and Uncle Scott. I didn't put any photos of them up there because I didn't want to frighten everybody. Anyway, so Papa Houston, okay, he grew up and came from a very humble, modest background as well. Basically a poor farm kid down in Kentucky, small family farm that he grew up on. He went into basic like grammar school, like my other grandfather, kind of a one-room schoolhouse where he was learning reading, writing, arithmetic. Stories from his childhood. I always remember him telling me that, he kind of called himself like a little hillbilly kid through the summertime, where he's like, you couldn't get him to put shoes on, and he'd run around barefoot all summer long, kind of working on the farm, doing what kids would do down there. And he said like his feet would get so calloused up that he could walk right across like, driveways of gravel and whatnot, and wouldn't faze him at all. Because I always remember when I was a kid, if I took my shoes off in the summertime and was walking, I'd be like, ooh, ah. And you're like, man, that wouldn't faze me at all back when I was a kid. Of course, I wore shoes most of the time too, so my feet never toughened up. Uh, anyway, Papa Houston, similar education to background to my grandpa Stan, where he was in like a one-room schoolhouse learning reading, writing, arithmetic, but working on the farm quite a bit too. Well, most people down south were lived kind of below the poverty line. And we had talked a while ago about like the Great Migration back in the 19 teens and 20s, where a lot of black families left the South, of course, because of like Jim Crow racism and oppression that was going on down there back then, specifically targeting the black community. But the North offered better job and educational opportunities. Well, it wasn't just black families that were moving up north. Millions of white families did too. They came up north looking for better opportunities, a chance to make a better life for their family and earn more money and higher wages. Well, definitely coming up and working in the auto industry would pay a lot better and give you much more material wealth than being a small-time farmer. So his whole family eventually transitioned up here, and I think my papa was about in 8th grade when he came up too. Now he finished high school, went all the way through, which, that wasn't as common back then as it is today. So I'd even say that, he was, for the time, kind of fairly highly educated, because it was super rare to go to college unless you were kind of like elite and wealthy and upper crust. But Papa Huston actually he didn't go to an actual like college or university, but he did get some post high school training as well. Now, about the time he was finishing up with that was when World War II broke out, and then the Pearl Harbor attack happens, and young men start getting drafted up and called to serve their country. Well, I guess his draft number had basically come up, but he hadn't been ordered to report for duty yet. And he made the decision that, rather than going into the infantry or getting put in the Navy, because if you did get drafted, probably this is a kind of a ballpark guess, but probably about a 75% chance you at that point in the war you were going to get put into the army and just be infantry. Or then the other thing is they would sort some guys out and put them onto naval ships and transport vessels. But not many guys were getting selected to go into the Air Corps, which is kind of a new part of the Army. Now, the Air Force was not its own separate branch back in this era as it is today. Back then, if you were in the Air Force, essentially, it was the Army Air Corps. It was part of the Army. So Papa Huston, before he could actually get drafted, he went and enlisted and volunteered and specifically requested to be an airman. So that's kind of cool. You know what I mean? He saw that new technology coming out and those planes flying around super fast. And of course, being a poor farm kid from Kentucky or even up working in the auto industry, the odds of you ever getting to fly like state-of-the-art aircraft like that would be very low unless you went into the military and under circumstances kind of like this. Well, initially, now Papa Huston is a very smart, very intelligent guy. He might not have a college or university degree, but no doubt in my mind, he would have been capable of earning that, no problem. Super bright guy, very, very savvy. So he also is quite fit. He cut a good figure, man, and is about the right size to be a pilot. You can't be like 6'5" or like super short either. You have to be kind of in a range of height and have a kind of slim build to qualify to be in flight school, especially even back at that time, just due to the size of like the cockpits and stuff in P-51 Mustangs. Also, they definitely didn't let any dummies do that. You had to have decent test scores and stuff and have a fairly high aptitude to qualify for like pilot school. Well, he qualified for that and was hoping to go fly P-51 Mustangs, those fighter planes, the best fighter planes that we really had through the war. However, his mother, I guess, freaked out about that. So my great grandma, that worried her a lot. You know what I mean? She's like, man, that sounds really, really dangerous. So at his mother's request, because she was really concerned about him being a fighter pilot and them having super high like casualty rates, he asked to get transferred to a bomber crew, where a younger guy at his age, he would have almost certainly gone in to be a gunner, which is what ended up happening. Now, I guess the story goes after he comes out of gunnery school, he's talking to his mom again before he gets deployed and kind of explains what he's going to be doing as a top turret gunner on a B-17 Flying Fortress. And she said, so the story goes, something to the effect of, boy, that sounds pretty dangerous. If you're going to be up there, I would have rather you just been the one flying the plane. To which I'm sure Papa Huston had some sort of reaction in his head like, Oh, mother, are you kidding me? So after all that and him getting the transfer and all that, then it was like she would have preferred he would have been a fighter pilot anyway. Which, man, that would be a whole different set of stories if that had happened. Now, if that's something we could go back and change in history, I'm not sure that I would do it either because Papa Houston does survive the war on his B-17 Flying Fortress, but who knows how things would have panned out if he had been a fighter pilot. Maybe I wouldn't be here now, talking to you if that had happened because being a fighter pilot was a super dangerous job as well. So anyway, Papa Houston goes out like before you can go up and actually fly in the 8th Air Force and go on combat missions, you had to learn how to shoot first because you can imagine firing 50 cal machine guns up in the air in a moving plane and you're firing at another moving fighter plane, somebody from the German Luftwaffe. That's kind of tricky. It's not like just going out target shooting in your backyard. Now, it is a very challenging thing to fire with all of those variables going on. When he went to the gunnery school in Vegas, I guess he was an outstanding marksman, and he went in with a group of 300 guys. And he, at the end of it, they kind of would tell you your rankings, and he made the top 10 list out of 300 guys. So pretty elite group. And I guess he and some of the other guys asked, well, who was the number one, number two? Can we have the breakdown of the top 10? And they didn't have that data and wouldn't tell them, or maybe they did have the data and they didn't release information like that. But Papa Houston did say that, when he would look at the targets after he shot them, that he had hit bullseyes basically on every one of the scored shoots. So he thinks, according to him, that he feels like he probably finished possibly number one in the class. Of course, there could have been other guys in the gunnery school that had just as good, marksmanship scores as him. So, at the very least, he probably at least was the number one guy or tied. Now, a lot of people, if they told you a story like that, you might blow it off and say, "Ugh, they're just bragging," and you know what I mean, being braggadocio and tooting their own horn. For sure, if my Uncle Craig or Uncle Scott were in that spot and were telling me that, I'd be like, okay, sure you did. But the thing is, Papa Houston is a super modest guy. I know you guys don't know him, but I've spent tons of time with him, and he never brags about anything. So honestly, coming from a guy like Papa Houston, I think if he was saying that, he probably did finish right at the very top of the pack there. So he's a darn good shot. And that probably goes back to his childhood in Kentucky, too, because he did get quite a bit of experience shooting out on the farm and going hunting back when he was a kid. So it probably paid off at gunnery school. So now, he's out of gunnery school. He's getting deployed overseas. The 8th Air Force, as it was called, the 8th Air Force was the division of the Army, that Air Corps that was bombing Nazi Germany. So if you hear about any airmen like the Memphis Belle, for example, that we had talked about, and I showed you some scenes from that movie, they were in the 8th Air Force as well, the same as my Papa Houston. But, there were so many guys and so many crews in the 8th Air Force, they didn't keep them all at one airfield or in one town. They were scattered across southern England. So my Papa was in Ipswich, England, which I don't know much about it other than that's where my Papa was stationed. But apparently a small town in southern England. Now, going over there, you can imagine these guys are living over in England for extended periods of time. So they make friends with the local population. They get to know all the British people, are eating in their restaurants, going out, flirting with their daughters and such, and, drinking at the local pubs. I guess an old kind of a jokey type saying that the people in England would often say about our airmen in the 8th Air Force that were stationed over there was, the problem with airmen is that they're overpaid, oversexed, and over here. But I would have to imagine that Papa Houston, who is a very conservative guy, he's super polite, well-mannered, and also very very Christian man. I don't think he was over there raising too much hell in southern England, but hopefully he found a little time to get into some mischief. But I got to imagine that if you were going to have soldiers come and stationed right next to your house, he's the kind of guy you would want by you because, like I said, he is a very honorable, decent, nice guy. And it sounded like from most most of his stories, actually most of the airmen were pretty good dudes. But remember, like flyboys, and this goes back to even World War One, they always had the reputation of being kind of those dapper guys with the cool uniforms and a little more prestigious. And they did often have the reputation of being like partiers and drinkers and out at the clubs. It's just something about that's often associated with the pilots and flyboys and airmen. So anyway, like when he went over there initially, let me go on to the next slide now. Here we go. There's his crew. Now, initially, he had 10 guys in his crew. That was like from the scenes in the movie Memphis Belle. That was a 10-man crew. But that was during 1943. The Memphis Belle was the very first crew to complete its tour of duty. By the time you get to 1944, and my papa flies from the fall of 44 to the spring of 45. Basically, his last mission was like weeks before the end of the war in Europe. So his last mission was just like right at towards the end of the war when everything wraps up over there. But really, like through 1943, when the movie Memphis Belle would have been going on, the German Luftwaffe was quite strong. So the biggest threat to Allied bomber crews was, at least American bomber crews that are flying during daylight hours, it was German fighter planes coming up trying to shoot them down. Now, by 1944, by the time Papa Huston's over there, the German Luftwaffe has been beat up pretty bad. They don't have as many planes. A lot of their best pilots are goners by then. But the thing that made it more challenging and maybe even a little more dangerous by 1944 and 45 was the anti-aircraft, the flak, was much heavier and thicker because Hitler had given an order and he had repositioned a lot of his anti-aircraft guns around these prime German factories and cities and targets. So flying through, like when you get to the bomb run and the flak starts coming up, that was actually much thicker and much more dangerous for these guys. Anyway, so his crew initially was he trained back before they started flying combat missions with a 10-man crew. But then once they got over there, they made that shift to 9-man crews because the two waist gunners kind of in the middle belly part of the plane, by that point, because there was less German fighters, one guy could operate both of those guns and go back and forth. So that guy and I'm not sure what his name was, but my Papa Huston for sure remembers him and has mentioned it before to me. He got transferred to a different crew. Also, the guy that was the bottom ball turret gunner on his crew, which my Papa was the top turret gunner on the top of the plane. The ball turret guy, he got bumped off of the crew because somebody else with seniority bumped onto my Papa's crew. So once they were set with those 9 guys, that was his 9-man crew for the rest of the war. Kind of a sad part of the story. Both of the guys that got transferred out of his crew that he had trained with early on went to different crews, and both of them got shot down and did not survive the war. So man, that kind of hits close to home too. He knew those guys pretty well and had trained with them, and that's just speaks to how dangerous it was being an airman. Which Papa Huston often would tell me when he was telling me stories about this, because he was always very open about his experiences during World War II, which I loved as a kid. I ate that up. I loved hearing him talk about it, and I loved sitting and watching war movies with him. He said that his heart really went out to guys that were in the infantry, guys like my grandpa Stan, who were out there on the front lines fighting through the rain, the snow, the muck, seeing the enemy up close, face to face. He said, man, those conditions would have been really trying and it would have been often quite miserable. Where in contrast, the guys, the airmen, they had a warm bed to sleep in every night. They probably had better food. They got to hang out with, friendly British people and go to parties or bars and stuff every now and then. The trade-off was that the airmen actually did statistically the most dangerous job. So even though they lived in more relative comfort, when they actually did go fly these combat missions, the odds of them dying and not coming back home were way up. So you kind of had better odds of surviving if you were actually out in the infantry, but you'd probably lived a little bit more comfortable if you were one of the airmen. So kind of a trade-off. I remember we had talked about that a little bit back in World War I as well. So I guess Papa Houston had the fortune of being getting teamed up with a really really good experienced pilot. Another thing, when I would sit and watch movies with him as a kid, like we watched Memphis Belle together once, he was kind of critical of that movie. He said, it depicts the B-17 really well. Some of the action scenes are good. It shows some real like challenges and obstacles that these air crews would have to overcome. But he said what he didn't like about the movie was, and remember, I told you this, if you did watch the scenes of the movie with my commentary, that they fictionalized all the characters in that movie. Now, there really was a real Memphis Belle crew, but they didn't use the names or like even try to mimic the personalities of the real guys from that crew. That was all fictionalized. And constantly throughout the movie, they're like talking back to the captain. They're kind of giving nasty jokes to each other. There's tension and drama. Papa Houston said that, his crew was nothing like that. That if the captain gave an order, everybody on his crew respected their captain tremendously. And they trusted him with their lives. And if he gave an order, you followed the order. He said there was no backtalk, that they were a close-knit team, kind of a band of brothers, if you will, where they're trusting each other with their lives, and they know that by working together, that's their best odds of surviving the war and getting back home. So he said a lot of that. He thought, there could have been other air crews, other bomber crews that did have that tension and drama, but he said most of the crews that he knew were actually highly disciplined and followed orders. And there's a lot of that drama in the movies. It just that's they put that kind of stuff in movies so they can sell more tickets and have more drama in the film. But often that's not true to real life conditions or what actually went down. So he had a very experienced captain. Part of having an experienced, top-notch captain was they ended up being a lead plane in their squadron. So they often were like the front plane in this whole formation of bombers, where all of the other planes in the formation will queue and watch that lead plane, and they follow its lead. And then when that plane drops its bombs, they'll all drop their bombs. Lead planes also had some special, like state-of-the-art radar equipment that would get transferred in and out and was constantly being tinkered with. So the crew Memphis Belle that we had talked about, and I showed you the image where it was like the Memphis Belle was supposed to be the captain's good-looking girlfriend from Memphis, Tennessee, and they had a painting of her on the front nose of the plane. In real life, if you, like most bomber crews did have a name, had like a logo that the captain would pick and they would paint up there. But if you were a lead plane, you didn't get that because lead planes got rotated in and out. So every time my papa flew a mission, he would be flying with the same guys, but they would be on a different plane each time. Now, if they had their own one permanent plane, their crew's name, because they still picked a name, like a team name, was the Cultured Vulture, actually. And I thought this was a really cool part of the story. At least I appreciated it a lot. My Papa Houston was the one that actually drew up their artwork. So that image right there is like the logo, what would have been on the nose of their bomber had they had their one own permanent bomber that they kept for every mission. So you got the big vulture up there, and then it's got one of its feet resting on a skull. And I don't know if you look real close there, you can probably tell the skull has a little Hitler mustache and Hitler haircut. I always thought that's pretty awesome. That's way cooler than having some Southern girl painted on the nose of your plane. I love something like this, like the vulture coming to drop bombs on the Nazis. So anyway, they're a lead plane, which that often made you more of a target because the Germans know, and they have bomber crews, or at one time had their own bomber crews, and know the lead planes are the most important. So really, statistically, that's even kind of one of the more dangerous jobs, being that front point plane. Now, you would fly 30 missions, and that was your tour of duty. Let me go on to the next slide here. So over there is a list of all the missions, all the combat missions that my papa flew. Now, actually being a lead plane, they would fly a lot more training missions than other crews. So he actually got more airtime than most normal airmen or crewmen of a B-17 would, because they were flying lots of training missions too. But he ended up flying 29 combat missions, and 30 was the mark you had to hit to finish your tour of duty. Now, he actually completed his tour of duty, but the reason for that was why he didn't hit 30. His pilot had subbed on another crew and flew one extra mission. And typically, the airmen on one crew, you're tied to your pilot. So in his case, once the pilot had hit 30, the rest of them were close enough that they just finished up their tour. Now, why would they do 30 missions and you're out? Well, think about it. This is statistically like the most dangerous job you can have in the war. So if airmen were just told, you're just going to keep flying missions until, well, the war is over or until you end up getting shot down and killed, that's kind of a depressing thing. It doesn't really give you a lot of hope. Also, like today, we know the war ends in the spring of 1945, but they didn't know that back at the time. Maybe the war was going to go on until 1946, 47, 48. There really was no way of knowing. So setting that mark of like you hit 30 combat missions, it's like it's a dangerous job, but you get through those 30 missions and you made it. Now, you could go and sub on other crews because occasionally, a plane wouldn't get shot down, but they might take heavy fire or something, and one or two guys on the crew might get killed. So, like if another crew, if a German fighter plane came in and shot and killed their top turret gunner, Papa Houston could have went and subbed on one of those crews when his crew wasn't up in the rotation to go fly. He could fly an extra mission, and it would count on his list and get him out of the war a little bit sooner. However, he knew a lot of guys. That was a common thing because a lot of guys wanted to get back home and wanted to have their tour of duty done. But he knew multiple guys that had subbed on other crews and then ended up getting shot down when they were out doing that submission with another crew. And he kind of felt like his crew was so close knit and they trusted each other, they worked good together, that he felt like, just all things considered, how dangerous this job was. He felt like his best odds of getting back home were just to fly his missions, not to rush it, and stay with the guys that he knew, was comfortable with, and trusted. Now, the conditions up there in any B-17 bomber, I think these planes fly super high. It's not like World War I anymore, where they're just kind of buzzing the trenches and flying, at max, like probably a mile above the sky. These planes would fly, their max altitude, it would be about 25,000 feet. So think about that. That's like up 5 miles in the sky. What's it like when you're 5 miles up, when you're at 25,000 foot elevation? It's frigid cold. Even in the middle of summertime, it's sub-zero temperatures up there. They taught you in in the movie Memphis Belle, you'd see those guys wearing those heavy like bomber jackets with wool liners. Well, those bomber jackets, they look awesome and they're really cool, but it was also had a practical purpose to keep these guys warm up there when it was 20, 30, 40, 50 below when they're flying these missions, and they're up there for long, sometimes 14, 16, 20 hours. So it's a long time to be up there and be really cold and exposed to that. Now, they'd also have to wear gloves and stuff. If you ever seen the movie Christmas Story, where that kid goes out and licks the phone pole in the middle of winter and his tongue sticks to it, well, if you had just a little moisture or sweat on your hands and you went up and then a fighter's coming in and you touch your gun and grab it, your hands would freeze right to the metal. So you had to wear those gloves. And also, when you get up that high, the oxygen is super thin. So think that in the movie Memphis Belle, they're constantly taking their masks off, those oxygen masks. And that's because it's a movie and they want to show the actors' faces and stuff. But when you're flying that high up, you had to keep that oxygen mask off. You might be able to take it off for a few seconds or something or readjust. But if you take that off for an extended period of time, you're going to black out. It's going to make you, pass out because your brain's not going to get enough oxygen. Once you would come down to about 10,000 feet, then you could take your oxygen off. It wouldn't be quite as cold, but for a lot of the mission, they're flying sky high up there. Also, it's loud. I mean, think like the roar of those engines, and then you have open windows in the plane. I guess the roar was just incredibly loud. And I talked about how my grandpa Stan had major hearing loss, from grenades going off and artillery and mortars and firing his own gun. Well, I imagine the same would potentially be true for all of these airmen too, except because it was just so loud all the time, you wouldn't be able to talk to the guys even sitting like right next to you. You had to wear like earmuffs because these guys needed to communicate. So actually, they had some more state-of-the-art technology for the time, and they wore like earmuffs. They almost look like shooting muffs that you would wear today if you were out shooting your rifle or something. but they had a comm system in them. So when you would talk, you would talk into like a little microphone there, and anybody else on your crew that had their headset on, which everybody should have those on, would hear what you said. So you couldn't be blabbing your mouth the whole time up there because you're going to tie up the comm, and messages wouldn't be conveyed around. So most of the time you were supposed to kind of zip it and be quiet. The captain would give out orders, and everybody's looking for enemy fighters. And if you see one, you call it out, and then everybody on the crew is looking in that direction, trying to find the bogeys that are coming for you. Now, they also had a radio system on the plane where they could communicate, if necessary, with other planes in the squadron. So multiple layers of radios up there. Let me think here. The top turret. Oh, so my grandpa was a top turret gunner. The turrets had it was on a hydraulic swivel. Now, to give you a little more insight into how loud it is, his station, that top turret, is about 5 or 6 feet behind the pilot and co-pilot. Well, I guess one mission where Papa Houston was up there, he had his flak jacket on, and they must have been getting kind of closer to the bombing run, but he was looking around, hadn't seen any planes, and he was about to get out of the turret. But his flak jacket caught on kind of like the joystick that would take it and turn it and swivel it. And he had taken his comm set off because they weren't that comfortable. So he had taken that and hung it up over, kind of on the wall of the plane. But it was at a place where he couldn't reach it. And then he was getting out of the turret, and he pulled that hydraulic swivel on accident, and it pinched him. It pressed his chest and back into the turret, and trapped him in there and was crushing him. And he said he yelled and yelled at the pilot and co-pilot, who were literally a few feet away from him, and they couldn't hear anything he was saying. Now, I guess eventually he was able to reach back there and get himself freed up. And afterwards, when he got home from that mission, he had a big bruise on his chest and back. And he said, he had nobody to blame but himself. If he had been wearing his comm set like he was supposed to, he could have just said in there that, somebody come help me out. And somebody else on the crew would have been right over there to help him with it. But he had taken that comm set off, and even being just a few feet away from, another guy on your crew, they wouldn't be able to hear you because it's just so darn loud up there. Now, I also asked my papa quite a few times, if he had any other memorable moments or just crazy war stories or scary experiences. And, one that always stuck with us grandkids was that he said, the first time he ever flew in a combat mission and was coming into the bomb run, and the top turret gunner is kind of, his spot is several feet behind the cockpit of the plane. So he had a good view looking out ahead of him. The first time he ever flew a combat mission was coming into that bomb run and started seeing the flak blowing up, and boom, you could hear the puffs and these massive explosions going on right outside the plane, that he said it just sent a chill down his spine. And he just felt like, oh boy, I'm in it now, because he realized, that's the most dangerous part of the mission. And, he could literally be killed at any second. One of those cannons could hit him. So I guess on subsequent missions, he said he didn't have that bone chilling, just blood curdling, kind of moment of terror, because you get used to it, and he adapted and kind of acclimated to it. But he did say that first mission ever, when he came into the bomb run and started seeing the flak field ahead of him, that was kind of a terrifying experience. To give you an idea of how powerful those anti-aircraft guns are, another pretty memorable story was, by this point in the war, 1944, we would have bomber escorts escort these squadrons of bombers, which would be a squadron of P-51s that would fly with them. And if the German Luftwaffe showed up and tried shooting our bombers down, well, then we would have these maneuverable fighter planes defending them, and they could go fight off the German fighter planes. He said one time they were also coming into the bomb run, and he was, doing his checks and going back and forth, kind of being vigilant and looking around in the sky. And he happened to notice a P-51 Mustang that flew up right next to him, and he could actually see the pilot in there. They kind of made eye contact, and he said that the pilot of that P-51, they made eye contact together, and he kind of tipped his wings, basically giving him a wave. And I guess Papa Houston kind of took his guns and put them up and down like that to give a wave back. And then seconds later, he went over and he checked the other side, and then he heard boom, a flak explosion to the side of the plane. And by the time he turned back over, that P-51 Mustang was gone. It had taken a direct hit from one of these anti-aircraft guns, and bam, blown to smithereens, nothing left, and that pilot is a goner. And I guess that was kind of a chilling experience too, because what are the odds that could have just as easily hit Papa Houston's plane? And if you take a hit like that, even in a big bomber, good chance it's going to take your plane right down. And generally, when planes went down, there are sometimes, I guess, guys could get out and use their parachute and float down to safety and be taken as a POW because you're going to be behind German lines. But most of the time, when one of these B-17s went down, the crew was goners. I know. I also often asked Papa Houston, like, did you ever feel like you actually shot down a German fighter when you would see them coming around? And remember, he was one of the best gunners out of his class, so I figured, hey, if any of these machine gunners on a B-17 crew is going to take out some a German fighter plane, Papa Houston's as good a bet as any of them to do it. And he said, that it was really hard to tell because it's a lot of chaos up there. You're flying in a tight formation, and if you had those fighters coming in like that, you're going to have hopefully multiple gunners, like all the top gunners in a squadron ideally are shooting at that plane. So it's hard to tell who's actually maybe hit the plane. He said he did see German like Me-109s go down, where for sure it was that their squadron took that plane out. But whether he was the one that fired the shots that actually took the plane down or not, pretty hard to tell. He did say that he felt like there was 2 occasions where he saw German planes go down that he was shooting at that he felt like he probably got them. But again, it's really hard to tell up there, and he never actually pursued trying to get a confirmed kill. I'm not quite sure what the process was, but you had to have several other airmen also verify that you took the shot like that. And honestly, at the end of the day, it's all about getting your job done, doing your duty, and surviving and getting back home. So that kind of gets at most of the most memorable stories that I'd want to share with you guys regarding Papa Houston's experience over there during World War II. I'll tell you what, what a crazy time to live through. And when we talk about like the greatest generation, man, I think both of my grandpas are great examples of why that generation as a whole, and definitely know that their stories, while they are unique to them, are also at the same time very common. There were millions of young men that had very similar experiences, grew up during the Depression too, and then went over there, sacrificed, were courageous, and won this war for America and put down fascist Nazi Germany. You know, Papa Houston and my grandpa Stan both went on to live amazing lives after the war, which is a big credit to them because, it's really, I think, easy for a lot of guys that go through traumatic experiences like this to shut down and for it to change them and scar them. And I'll tell you what, both of these guys were just amazing human beings that were so kind and gentle and just such positive role models to me. And then at the same time, they also would often share these experiences with me, which was so cool to me as a kid that was really into history. I love that. And I'm so eternally grateful for having both of these fine men as my grandfathers. So I hope I did them proud with this retelling of some of their experiences. They truly are a part of what makes the greatest generation the greatest generation. So with that, I'll sign off. I hope you enjoyed their experiences, and hopefully maybe it inspires you to go look into some of your family's background and check out some cool stories, whether it's World War II related or not. Go see what your family's done and look into your family's past. I can tell you I had a lot of fun putting this whole presentation together. Take care.